Nero didn't just burn Rome to the ground. While the city blazed and thousands died in the flames, he allegedly played his lyre and composed poetry about the beauty of destruction. But the fire was just the beginning. This was an emperor who kicked his pregnant wife to death, married a man in a public ceremony, and built a golden palace so massive it covered a third of the city. And Nero wasn't even the worst. When absolute power meets human nature, the results are always catastrophic, and the Roman Empire produced some of the most shocking examples of what happens when unlimited authority corrupts the human soul. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Empire gave individual men more power than any humans had ever possessed before. Emperors controlled the lives and deaths of millions, commanded vast armies, and were worshipped as living gods. But with that power came a complete disconnect from normal human experience, and the psychological effects were devastating. Over nearly 5 centuries of imperial rule, Rome produced emperors who committed acts of cruelty, excess, and sheer madness that still shock us today. What drove these men to such extremes? How did absolute power transform them from human beings into monsters? And what can their stories teach us about the corrupting nature of unlimited authority? The answers reveal the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrible price that societies pay when they concentrate too much power in the hands of too few people. Augustus himself managed to maintain some connection to reality, partly because he had lived through the civil wars that brought him to power and understood the fragility of political authority. He surrounded himself with advisors who could speak honestly to him, maintained many republican institutions as a check on his own power, and generally tried to present himself as the first citizen rather than an absolute monarch. The real problems began with Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and chosen successor. Tiberius had spent decades as a successful military commander, but the transition to supreme power revealed personality traits that had been hidden during his years of service. Initially, he attempted to rule responsibly, but the combination of unlimited authority and the constant fear of assassination gradually warped his judgment and behavior. Tiberius's paranoia was not entirely unjustified. Roman emperors faced constant threats from ambitious senators, rival claimants to the throne, and their own family members who saw murder as a legitimate path to power. But his response to these threats was excessive and ultimately self-destructive. He began seeing conspiracies everywhere, executing senators on the flimsiest evidence and creating a climate of fear that made actual conspiracies more likely. The emperor's retreat to the island of Capri in 26 CE marked a turning point in the nature of imperial rule. Isolated from the day-to-day realities of governing, surrounded only by flatterers and informants, Tiberius became increasingly disconnected from the empire he was supposed to rule. Reports from this period describe a man consumed by suspicion, spending his days reading reports of alleged plots and ordering executions based on rumors and dreams. On Capri, Tiberius indulged in excesses that would have been unthinkable for a traditional Roman aristocrat. He built elaborate villas where he could engage in activities that scandalized even the jaded Roman elite. The island became a laboratory for imperial decadence, where the normal rules of Roman society were suspended and the emperor's every whim became law. The isolation also allowed Tiberius's cruelest impulses to flourish without check. He reportedly enjoyed watching prisoners being tortured and took personal interest in devising new methods of execution. The famous Tiberian leap involved throwing condemned prisoners off the cliffs of Capri while the emperor watched from above. These activities were not driven by political necessity, but by the psychological satisfaction that absolute power gave him in inflicting suffering on others. But it was Caligula, Tiberius's successor, who truly demonstrated the dangers of unlimited imperial authority. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, he earned the nickname Caligula, Little Boots, as a child when he accompanied his father's legions on campaign dressed in miniature military gear. The soldiers' affection for the boy emperor would prove tragically misplaced. Caligula began his reign with genuine popularity, releasing political prisoners, hosting spectacular games, and distributing generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome. For the first few months, it seemed that Rome had finally found an emperor who could use absolute power responsibly. Then something changed, and historians still debate whether it was mental illness, the corrupting effect of unlimited authority, or simply the revelation of character traits that had been hidden during his youth. The transformation was rapid and shocking. Within a year of taking power, Caligula had exhausted the imperial treasury on games, gifts, and building projects of unprecedented extravagance. When senators questioned his spending, he responded by accusing them of treason and confiscating their property to fund further excesses. The message was clear: the emperor's wishes were the only law that mattered. Caligula's demand for divine honors went far beyond anything his predecessors had claimed. He erected statues of himself in temples throughout the empire, demanded to be worshipped as a living god, and claimed to have regular conversations with Jupiter and other deities. When the Jewish population of Alexandria refused to place his statue in their synagogue, he threatened to destroy the entire city and enslave its population. The emperor's relationship with the Senate became increasingly hostile and bizarre. He allegedly planned to make his favorite horse Incitatus a consul, not as a joke, but as a deliberate humiliation of the senatorial class. The horse lived in a marble stable with ivory mangers and purple blankets, received visitors like a human dignitary, and was rumored to have been invited to dinner parties where it was served the same food as human guests. Military campaigns became opportunities for Caligula to indulge his megalomania rather than serve Roman interests. During his expedition to Germania, he allegedly declared war on the sea god Neptune and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war. He built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor, claiming to have surpassed the legendary conqueror's achievements. The emperor's building projects reflected his complete disconnection from fiscal reality and human needs. He began construction of aqueducts that served no practical purpose, temples dedicated to his own worship, and palaces that covered vast areas of Rome. When citizens complained about the cost, he reminded them that he had the power of life and death over every person in the empire, and that questioning his judgment was tantamount to treason. Caligula's treatment of his family members revealed the paranoid cruelty that unlimited power had fostered in him. He forced his uncle Claudius to serve as a court jester, humiliating the future emperor for his physical disabilities. He engaged in incestuous relationships with his sisters, not from passion, but as a demonstration of his power to violate any social taboo. When his sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made mourning for her a capital offense. The emperor's final months were marked by increasingly erratic behavior that convinced even his closest supporters that he had become a danger to the empire itself. He threatened to move the capital to Alexandria, planned to erect a colossal statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem, despite knowing it would trigger a massive revolt, and spoke openly of exterminating the entire Senate and replacing it with his horse and other favorites. When Nero became emperor at the age of 16, few could have predicted that he would become synonymous with artistic megalomania, urban destruction, and the persecution of Christians. Initially guided by competent advisors like Seneca the philosopher and Burrus the Praetorian prefect, the young emperor showed promise of reasonable governance. But as he matured and asserted his independence, the same absolute power that had corrupted his predecessors began to warp his personality in uniquely destructive ways. Nero's early years as emperor were marked by what historians call the quinquennium Neronois. 5 good years when the empire was well governed despite the emperor's youth. During this period, his advisors maintained effective control over policy while allowing Nero to indulge his artistic interests in relatively harmless ways. The emperor wrote poetry, played the lyre, and performed in private theatrical productions that satisfied his creative ambitions without scandalizing the Roman public. However, this benign phase ended when Nero began to chafe against the restraints his advisors had placed on his behavior. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had orchestrated his rise to power through marriage to the Emperor Claudius and the subsequent poisoning of her husband, But her attempts to control her son's reign led to an increasingly bitter conflict that would define the rest of his rule. The relationship between Nero and his mother represented one of the most psychologically complex power struggles in Roman history. Agrippina was an intelligent, ruthless woman who had committed multiple murders to place her son on the throne, but she expected to govern through him as the power behind the imperial seat. Nero, however, was determined to rule in his own right and began to see his mother's influence as an intolerable limitation on his authority. The conflict came to a head when Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as an alternative claimant to the throne. Nero's response was swift and decisive. He had Britannicus poisoned during a family dinner, using a toxin so potent that the young man died within minutes of consuming it. The message to his mother was unmistakable. No one, not even family members, could threaten his power and expect to survive. But Agrippina proved more resilient than her son had expected. Rather than submitting to his authority, she began building her own network of supporters among the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. This led Nero to conclude that his mother's continued existence was incompatible with his security as emperor, and he began planning her assassination with the same calculating cruelty that had characterized previous imperial family murders. The method Nero chose for his mother's death revealed both his paranoia about appearing responsible for the crime and his fascination with elaborate theatrical effects. Rather than simple poison or a knife attack, he commissioned the construction of a collapsible boat designed to sink and drown his mother during what was supposed to be a pleasure cruise. The plan was so complex that it almost failed. Agrippina survived the shipwreck and swam to shore, forcing Nero to send soldiers to finish the job with conventional weapons. The murder of Agrippina marked a psychological turning point for Nero, removing the last person who could exercise any meaningful restraint over his behavior. With his mother dead and his advisors increasingly marginalized, the emperor began to indulge his artistic ambitions in ways that scandalized Roman society and consumed enormous resources that could have been used for legitimate imperial purposes. Nero's passion for performance was not simply a hobby or a harmless eccentricity. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of his role as emperor and the dignity that office was supposed to maintain. Roman aristocrats were expected to participate in public life through politics, military service, and patronage of the arts, but direct participation in theatrical performances was considered degrading behavior suitable only for slaves and freedmen. The emperor's insistence on performing in public represented a deliberate rejection of traditional Roman values and an assertion of his power to redefine social norms according to his personal preferences. When he appeared on stage as a musician, actor, or chariot racer, he was not simply entertaining the crowd, he was demonstrating that his authority was so absolute that he could violate any social taboo without consequences. These performances were carefully choreographed affairs, where the emperor's victory was predetermined regardless of his actual skill level. Audiences were required to applaud enthusiastically and were forbidden from leaving during his performances, no matter how long they lasted. Some of Nero's recitals reportedly went on for hours, with spectators fainting from exhaustion while being forced to maintain expressions of rapt attention. The emperor's artistic pursuits also provided justification for increasingly expensive and impractical building projects. Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea, was a palace complex so vast that it covered approximately 200 acres in the heart of Rome, featuring an artificial lake, extensive gardens, and a 120-foot-tall statue of the emperor himself. The building's opulence was unprecedented. Rooms were decorated with gold leaf, precious stones, and ivory, while mechanical devices provided special effects like flower petals falling from rotating ceiling panels. The construction of the Golden House required the demolition of large areas of central Rome, displacing thousands of residents and destroying historic buildings that had stood for centuries. When citizens complained about the cost and disruption, Nero reportedly dismissed their concerns by declaring that he was finally beginning to live like a human being, implying that everyone else's living conditions were subhuman by comparison. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE provided Nero with both his greatest crisis and his greatest opportunity. The fire burned for 6 days and nights, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of Romans homeless. While the emperor was not in the city when the fire started, his response to the disaster would define his historical legacy and provide the foundation for legends that persist to this day. Contrary to popular belief, Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned, the violin had not yet been invented, and historical sources indicate that he was actually an Anzio when the fire began. When he returned to Rome, he opened his own palaces to house refugees and organized relief efforts that probably saved thousands of lives. However, his subsequent actions would overshadow these initial humanitarian responses and create lasting suspicions about his role in the disaster. The emperor's decision to use the cleared land for his Golden House expansion created widespread belief that he had either started the fire deliberately or had prevented effective firefighting efforts to create space for his building projects. Whether these accusations were true remains a matter of historical debate, but Nero's behavior in the aftermath of the fire certainly suggested that he viewed the disaster as a convenient opportunity rather than a tragedy. The persecution of Christians that followed the fire represented Nero's attempt to deflect blame for the disaster onto a vulnerable minority group. Christians were already viewed with suspicion by many Romans because of their refusal to participate in traditional religious ceremonies and their exclusive claims about salvation. Nero's accusation that they had started the fire provided a convenient scapegoat for public anger while allowing him to stage spectacular public executions that served as entertainment for the masses. The methods used to execute Christians during this persecution were deliberately designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified, and still others were burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's garden parties. These executions were not simply punishments, they were theatrical productions designed to demonstrate the emperor's power while providing grotesque entertainment for audiences who had become accustomed to increasingly extreme forms of violence. While Nero's reign established the template for imperial excess and cruelty, later emperors would prove that there were always new depths of depravity to explore when unlimited power met unstable personalities. Commodus and Elagabalus, separated by nearly a century, would each find unique ways to abuse their authority and scandalize even the jaded Roman public with their bizarre behavior and destructive policies. Commodus came to power in 80 CE as the son of Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's most respected philosopher-emperors. This transition from the heights of imperial wisdom to the depths of imperial madness illustrated how the corrupting effects of absolute power could overcome even the best possible upbringing and education. Marcus Aurelius had tried to prepare his son for responsible leadership, providing him with the finest tutors and gradually introducing him to the complexities of imperial administration. However, the young man who inherited the throne bore little resemblance to his stoic father. Where Marcus Aurelius had viewed imperial power as a burden to be borne for the good of the empire, Commodus saw it as an opportunity for unlimited self-indulgence. The contrast was so stark that some historians have speculated that Commodus was not actually Marcus Aurelius's biological son, though there is no definitive evidence to support this theory. The new emperor's first major policy decision was to abandon his father's military campaigns and return to Rome for a series of triumph celebrations that lasted for months. This retreat from the frontiers reversed decades of careful strategic planning and allowed barbarian tribes to reclaim territories that had cost thousands of Roman lives to secure. But Commodus was uninterested in military glory of the traditional sort. He was planning to achieve immortality through a very different kind of combat. Commodus's obsession with gladiatorial combat went far beyond the typical imperial interest in arena games. While previous emperors had used gladiatorial contests as a way to entertain the masses and demonstrate their wealth, Commodus saw the arena as a stage for his own personal performances. He genuinely believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules and was determined to prove his divine status through physical combat. The emperor's gladiatorial career began with carefully staged private contests, where he fought against opponents who were ordered to lose convincingly, but not too easily. These early fights allowed him to develop genuine skills with various weapons while maintaining the illusion that he was defeating legitimate challengers. As his confidence grew, he began appearing in public arenas, eventually fighting in the Colosseum before audiences of thousands. The spectacle of an emperor fighting as a gladiator was unprecedented and deeply disturbing to traditional Roman sensibilities. Gladiators were slaves, criminals, or desperate volunteers who fought because they had no other options. They represented the lowest levels of Roman society. For the supreme ruler of the empire to willingly participate in such degrading activities suggested a complete breakdown of social order and imperial dignity. Commodus's arena performances were elaborately choreographed affairs designed to showcase his supposed divine powers. He typically fought against wild animals that had been weakened or partially drugged, or against human opponents who were given inferior weapons and armor. His victories were celebrated as proof of his godlike abilities, and he collected enormous fees for his appearances, reportedly charging 1 million sesterces per performance. The emperor's identification with Hercules extended beyond the arena into his daily life and public image. He commissioned statues showing himself with the hero's traditional club and lion skin, renamed months of the year after his various titles and accomplishments, and insisted that official documents refer to him as the living incarnation of the legendary demigod. Rome itself was briefly renamed Commodiana in his honor, though this change was quickly reversed after his death. The administrative chaos that resulted from Commodus's obsession with personal glory was enormous. While he spent his time training for arena combat and planning elaborate festivals in his own honor, the actual business of governing the empire was delegated to a series of favorites who used their positions to enrich themselves through corruption and extortion. The emperor showed no interest in these abuses, as long as they didn't interfere with his entertainment schedule. The psychological isolation that had affected previous emperors was particularly pronounced in Commodus's case. Surrounded by flatterers who praised his every action and terrified subordinates who dared not contradict him, he gradually lost all connection to reality. He began to believe that his staged victories in the arena represented genuine supernatural powers and that his position as emperor was confirmation of his divine nature. Nearly a century later, Elagabalus would demonstrate that imperial madness could take forms that were even more bizarre and destructive than Commodus's gladiatorial obsessions. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus in Syria, he became emperor at the age of 14 through the machinations of his grandmother Julia Maesa, who orchestrated a successful military coup against the reigning emperor Macrinus. The young emperor's reign was dominated by his devotion to the Syrian sun god Elagabalus, from whom he took his imperial name. This religious obsession went far beyond simple piety to encompass a complete reorganization of Roman religious life around the worship of a foreign deity that most Romans found alien and offensive. Elagabalus transported a sacred black stone from Syria to Rome and built an enormous temple where it was worshipped with rituals that scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities. The emperor's attempt to make Elagabalus the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon represented a direct assault on centuries of religious tradition and cultural identity. He forced senators and other officials to participate in Syrian religious ceremonies, married his god to various Roman goddesses in elaborate symbolic weddings, and declared that all other deities were merely servants of his patron god. These religious innovations were seen as acts of cultural vandalism that threatened the very foundations of Roman civilization. Elagabalus's personal behavior was even more shocking than his religious policies. He married and divorced multiple times, including unions with a Vestal virgin whose vow of chastity was considered sacred, and with men in ceremonies that treated same-sex relationships as legitimate marriages. These actions violated some of the most fundamental taboos in Roman society and suggested that the emperor recognized no moral or legal restraints on his conduct. The emperor's apparent gender nonconformity was particularly disturbing to Roman sensibilities that viewed clear distinctions between male and female roles as essential to social order. Elagabalus reportedly wore women's clothing, used cosmetics and jewelry typically associated with women, and allegedly offered rewards to any physician who could transform him anatomically into a woman. These behaviors challenged not just gender norms, but the entire concept of imperial masculinity that had been central to Roman political culture. The administrative incompetence that resulted from Elagabalus's focus on religious and personal concerns was devastating for the empire. Important military and diplomatic decisions were made by teenage whims rather than strategic considerations. Provincial governors were appointed based on their willingness to participate in Syrian religious ceremonies rather than their administrative abilities, and the imperial treasury was drained by expensive religious festivals and building projects. The emperor's mother, Julia Soaemias, initially supported her son's reign, but gradually became concerned about the political backlash his behavior was generating. When it became clear that Elagabalus's continued rule threatened the stability of the entire dynasty, she began working with other family members to arrange his removal from power. The conspiracy that eventually killed him was led by his own grandmother, the same woman who had orchestrated his rise to the throne. The excesses of Rome's mad emperors were not simply personal tragedies or isolated incidents of individual corruption. They represented systematic failures that weakened the empire's institutions, drained its resources, and undermined the legitimacy of imperial rule. The long-term consequences of these reigns extended far beyond the immediate damage they caused, contributing to political instability, economic crisis, and the gradual erosion of Roman power that would eventually lead to the empire's collapse. The financial cost of imperial madness was staggering and cumulative. Each successive emperor who indulged in megalomaniacal building projects, expensive games, and lavish personal displays left the imperial treasury more depleted than before. Caligula's reign alone is estimated to have cost the equivalent of several years' worth of normal imperial revenues, while Nero's Golden House and reconstruction projects after the Great Fire consumed resources that could have funded military campaigns or infrastructure improvements throughout the empire. These expenditures were not simply wasteful, they actively damaged the empire's long-term economic health. Money spent on Commodus's gladiatorial performances or Elagabalus's religious ceremonies was diverted from essential functions like military equipment, road maintenance, and provincial administration. The cumulative effect was a gradual degradation of the imperial government's ability to fulfill its basic responsibilities to its citizens and subjects. The taxation required to fund imperial excesses created widespread resentment among the population and contributed to economic decline in the provinces. As emperors demanded ever larger sums to finance their personal projects, provincial governors were forced to extract more wealth from local communities through increased taxes, forced loans, and outright confiscation of property. These policies impoverished the very people who were supposed to benefit from Roman rule and created conditions that made rebellion increasingly attractive. The debasement of Roman currency was another consequence of imperial fiscal irresponsibility. When conventional taxation could not generate enough revenue to fund their expenditures, emperors ordered the reduction of precious metal content in Roman coins. This practice allowed them to mint more currency from the same amount of gold and silver, but it also reduced the value of existing coins and contributed to inflation throughout the empire. The long-term effects included reduced confidence in Roman currency and increased difficulty in conducting international trade. Military morale and effectiveness suffered enormously under emperors who were more interested in personal entertainment than strategic planning. Soldiers who had joined the legions expecting to serve under competent commanders instead found themselves led by men who treated military campaigns as opportunities for theatrical performances or religious ceremonies. The abandonment of Marcus Aurelius's Germanic campaigns by Commodus sent a clear message that military service was no longer valued by the imperial government. The Praetorian Guard, which was supposed to protect the emperor and maintain stability in Rome, became increasingly politicized and corrupt as successive rulers used bribes and special privileges to secure their loyalty. This elite military unit gradually transformed from a professional force dedicated to imperial security into a mercenary organization that sold its support to the highest bidder. The frequent assassinations of emperors by their own guards demonstrated the complete breakdown of traditional loyalty relationships. Provincial administration deteriorated as competent governors were replaced by imperial favorites who lacked the skills or motivation necessary for effective leadership. Appointments were made based on personal loyalty, participation in religious ceremonies, or willingness to participate in imperial festivities rather than administrative experience or local knowledge. The results included increased corruption, reduced efficiency in tax collection, and growing alienation between Roman officials and provincial populations. The Senate's role in imperial government was systematically undermined by emperors who viewed it as either an obstacle to their personal desires or a source of entertainment through humiliation and abuse. Senators who had once provided institutional continuity and administrative expertise were reduced to frightened spectators who competed to flatter whichever emperor currently held power. This degradation of senatorial authority eliminated an important check on imperial power and reduced the quality of policy advice available to rulers. Religious and cultural conflicts multiplied as emperors promoted foreign deities, violated traditional taboos, and imposed their personal beliefs on unwilling populations. The persecution of Christians under Nero established a precedent for using religious minorities as scapegoats for imperial failures, while Elagabalus's promotion of Syrian religious practices created resentment among Romans who viewed such innovations as attacks on their cultural identity. These conflicts diverted energy from more pressing political and military challenges. The legal system was corrupted by emperors who treated laws as suggestions that could be ignored whenever they conflicted with imperial desires. Trials became theatrical performances, where verdicts were predetermined by the emperor's personal feelings about the defendants. Property rights became meaningless when emperors could confiscate wealth at will to fund their projects. The predictability and fairness that had made Roman law attractive to provincial populations gradually disappeared under the pressure of imperial arbitrariness. International relations suffered as foreign rulers observed the chaos and instability of imperial succession. Barbarian leaders who had once feared Roman military power began to recognize that the empire was weakening itself through internal conflicts and poor leadership. The respect that had been essential to Roman diplomatic effectiveness was gradually replaced by contempt and opportunism as neighboring powers prepared to take advantage of imperial weakness. The psychological trauma experienced by the Roman population under these reigns had lasting effects on political culture and social cohesion. People who had lived through periods of arbitrary executions, confiscatory taxation, and religious persecution developed a deep cynicism about imperial government and a focus on short-term survival rather than long-term planning. This erosion of civic trust made it more difficult for competent emperors to implement effective policies even when they managed to gain power. The precedents established by mad emperors influenced the behavior of their successors, creating a culture of imperial entitlement that persisted even when individual rulers were personally more reasonable. The accumulated damage from multiple reigns of imperial excess contributed to the broader crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire faced simultaneous military, economic, and political challenges that nearly destroyed it entirely. While competent leadership might have been able to address individual problems, the institutional weakness and resource depletion left by previous emperors made effective responses much more difficult. The empire's eventual recovery required extensive reforms that essentially created a new form of government to replace the system that had been corrupted beyond repair. The mad emperors of Rome provide timeless lessons about the corrupting effects of absolute power and the dangers of concentrating too much authority in the hands of individuals who lack the character to use it responsibly. Their reigns demonstrate that even the most sophisticated political systems can be destroyed by leaders who prioritize personal gratification over public service and who lose touch with the realities faced by the people they govern. The pattern that emerges from studying these rulers is remarkably consistent. Isolation from normal human relationships, surrounded by flatterers who reinforced their worst impulses, they gradually lost the ability to distinguish between their personal desires and the needs of the empire. The unlimited power that was supposed to enable them to serve Rome more effectively instead became a tool for satisfying increasingly bizarre and destructive fantasies. Perhaps most tragically, many of these emperors began their reigns with genuine potential for good leadership. Caligula was initially popular and implemented reasonable policies. Nero showed early signs of artistic talent that could have been channeled constructively, and even Commodus inherited a stable empire with experienced advisors. The transformation of these men from promising leaders into destructive tyrants illustrates how absolute power can corrupt even individuals who begin with good intentions. The relevance of these ancient stories to modern politics is undeniable. Contemporary leaders who surround themselves with yes-men, who use their positions to enrich themselves or their families, who treat criticism as treason, or who attempt to bypass institutional checks on their authority, are following patterns established by Rome's mad emperors. The specific methods may change with technology and culture, but the underlying dynamics of power corruption remain remarkably consistent. The ultimate lesson is that power must be limited, distributed, and subject to accountability if it is to serve constructive purposes.